Japanese couldn't believe he built a gun from a crashed plane's parts until he killed 20 of them. In December 1943, the American foothold on Bougainville was still fragile. The landing zones at Cape Torokina were secure, but 2 miles beyond them the jungle belonged to the Japanese 17th Army. Patrols sent past the perimeter faced ambushes, booby traps, and terrain so dense that men vanished even without enemy contact. Corporal Daniel Mercer, 23, was part of one of those patrols. Before the war, he worked as a farm mechanic near Pendleton, Oregon, repairing tractors and trucks with his father. He had joined the Army in 1942, assigned to the 129th Infantry Regiment of the 37th Infantry Division. He had no reputation for heroism or aggression. His superiors valued him for reliability, calm thinking, and fieldcraft learned during months of jungle training on New Georgia. His patrol leader, Sergeant Arthur Hawthorne, was a man in his late 20s, stocky, serious, and experienced. He had been with the division since Guadalcanal and knew the terrain better than most. Hawthorne had lost 2 friends earlier in the month when a Japanese infiltration team cut through their perimeter at night. Since then, he treated every patrol with strict discipline. On the morning of December 27th, Hawthorne's 8-man reconnaissance team received orders to move toward a narrow ravine believed to conceal a Japanese supply path. Allied intelligence suspected that small groups from the 6th Japanese Infantry Regiment were slipping supplies and messengers through this area to bypass American roadblocks. If true, those paths needed to be mapped, photographed, and, if possible, cut off. This was the patrol's mission. Locate signs of enemy movement, confirm the existence of a concealed supply route, and report back. They were not expected to fight a large force, only to observe. The patrol departed before sunrise. The men checked their gear carefully, rifles cleaned, bayonets secured, ammunition distributed evenly. Each man carried 2 canteens, insect repellent, and a small amount of food. They walked single file, 5 meters apart, following a barely visible path through thick undergrowth. The temperature rose quickly. By mid-morning, the air was heavy and difficult to breathe. Each step required pushing aside vines, thorny branches, and low-hanging roots. Leeches clung to their boots. Mosquitoes hovered around any exposed skin. These were the conditions that made movement slow and exhausting. Hawthorne signaled regularly for quiet halts, listening for anything unusual. He expected Japanese scouts to be active in the area. The Japanese were skilled at tracking and observing American patrols. They often shadowed them for hours before deciding when to strike. Mercer, 3rd in the file, paid attention to the ground. Part of his role on the patrol was to watch for signs of recent passage: broken twigs, boot prints, disturbed soil, dropped equipment. Twice he pointed out fragments of rice paper and a thin footprint partially obscured by leaves. Hawthorne nodded and passed the signal to keep advancing with extra caution. The ravine came into view shortly after noon. It was deeper and narrower than the map suggested. The vegetation grew thicker near the bottom, forming natural choke points. Visibility was poor. The sergeant studied the terrain and quietly instructed the men to spread out and move slowly. The patrol continued another 100 yards when the first shot was fired. The round hit the point man in the helmet, killing him instantly. The Japanese had positioned themselves above the ravine walls, giving them clear firing angles. A second shot followed immediately. Another soldier dropped. The rest sought what cover they could, but the ravine offered little protection. Gunfire intensified within seconds. Japanese light machine gun bursts cut through foliage. Grenades rolled down from above, exploding in sharp, violent flashes. The Americans tried to respond, but the enemy positions were concealed behind ferns and thick roots. Hawthorne attempted to regroup the men, shouting for them to fall back toward higher ground. Mercer crawled toward what looked like a shallow depression in the earth, trying to keep his head low. Something exploded nearby. Soil and splinters showered over him. The patrol was breaking apart. The men near the front could not withdraw. Those in the rear were cut off by fire. The Japanese, likely numbering between 8 and 12, pressed their advantage, firing in controlled bursts to prevent the Americans from forming a defensive line. Mercer lost sight of Hawthorne in the chaos. A grenade explosion threw him sideways, and he felt the impact of debris hitting his arm and shoulder. He tried to reach for his rifle, but another blast knocked it from his hands. The noise was disorienting. Shouts, gunfire, and the dull thud of grenades echoed through the ravine. Realizing the patrol was overwhelmed, Mercer began crawling toward a gap in the vegetation. He reached a cluster of vines and forced his body through, dragging himself up a slope away from the ravine. He could hear short cries behind him, orders shouted in Japanese, a single scream cut off abruptly, and then silence. By the time he reached the top of the ridge, the firefight had ended. The Japanese had ceased firing, likely moving down to confirm kills or gather equipment. Mercer kept moving, using every bit of strength left to increase the distance between himself and the ambush site. As the day faded, he found himself alone in an unfamiliar section of jungle. His uniform was torn, and his arm bled from a shallow fragment wound. He checked his gear. No rifle, no ammunition, and only a knife for protection. His canteen was half full, and he had less than a meal's worth of rations. He needed shelter, water, and a way back to friendly lines. But he was deep inside territory controlled by Japanese patrols. Then, sometime near dusk, he heard a distant mechanical noise, a low, uneven engine sound. He looked upward in time to see an American P-39 Airacobra descending erratically through the sky, trailing smoke. The pilot appeared to be fighting the controls, trying desperately to keep altitude. The aircraft vanished behind a ridge, followed by a loud, heavy crash. The sound echoed through the trees. Mercer stared for several seconds, breathing hard, weighing his options. A crash site could mean supplies, first aid materials, or even weapons, anything that might help him survive. He forced himself to his feet, steadied his breathing, and began moving toward the smoke rising above the ridge. He did not know whether he was walking toward danger or salvation. He only knew he could not survive long in the jungle unarmed. And so he pushed forward through the thick undergrowth, unaware that the wreck he was approaching would change the course of his next 2 days and force him to build something no soldier had ever attempted. Reaching the crash site took longer than Mercer expected. The terrain between the ridge and the plume of smoke was uneven and overgrown. He moved slowly, stopping frequently to listen for Japanese patrols that might also have heard the crash. The jungle played tricks on distance. What seemed close could be hundreds of yards away. When Mercer finally crested the final slope, he saw the aircraft. The Bell P-39 Airacobra lay partially embedded in the hillside, its fuselage twisted and torn open. The cockpit canopy had shattered on impact. One wing had snapped off and lay several meters away. The mid-engine design of the P-39 meant the engine sat behind the pilot's seat, and now that section was crushed inward. The smell of burnt oil hung in the air. The crash was recent. Steam still rose from hot metal exposed to damp air. A row of small fires smoldered along the broken wing route, but they were weakening. Mercer approached cautiously, scanning the surrounding jungle. A crash could attract Japanese soldiers within minutes. With the area still quiet, he stepped closer. Inside the cockpit, the pilot remained strapped in. The young man's flight suit and harness were intact, but his neck was at an unnatural angle. Mercer reached in, checked for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find, and then unfastened the dog tags. Second Lieutenant James W. Kitteridge, Yuzof, 22, barely a year younger than Mercer. He placed the tags in his pocket and lowered his head briefly. Then he began assessing the wreck. Mercer wasn't searching for souvenirs. He needed supplies, water, tools, medical materials, anything he could use in the next 24 hours. His chances of rescue were slim. His ability to stay hidden from Japanese patrols depended on what he could salvage now. He checked the pilot's emergency kit first. Standard issue contained a folding knife, a signal mirror, a small first aid pouch, a map case with survival instructions, 2 small water packets. Everything was intact. That alone increased his odds of surviving the next day. Next, he examined the aircraft structure for anything that could be repurposed. The crash had exposed many internal components. Hydraulic lines hung loose. Control rods lay bent and twisted. Electrical cables were scattered everywhere. What caught his attention most, however, were the remnants of the Aerocabra's forward weapons. The P-39 carried several guns in the nose. Typically a 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and 2.50 caliber or .30 caliber machine guns mounted above it. The crash had torn the weapons from their mounts and scattered fragments across the hillside. Mercer didn't expect to find anything usable. Aircraft weapons were normally destroyed or badly warped during high-impact crashes. But as he moved debris aside, he found something unexpected. One of the .30 caliber and /M2 machine gun barrel assemblies was still intact. The receiver was torn apart and unusable, but the barrel, return spring, and several internal pieces were in recoverable condition. They were covered in soot, but structurally sound. He examined the parts carefully. Years spent repairing equipment on the farm had taught him to judge the condition of metal by weight, sound, and feel. The barrel assembly was heavy but balanced. The springs still had tension. The firing pin, though bent, was present. Beside it lay a partially crushed ammunition box containing roughly 40.30 caliber rounds. Some were dented or tarnished, but many looked functional. Mercer held the barrel and thought for several seconds. A normal soldier would leave it, but he had no rifle. He had no ammunition for any American service weapon, and he had no expectation of encountering friendly forces soon. He needed a weapon, even an unreliable one. He continued searching the wreck for parts that could serve as a frame or housing. He found aluminum struts from the landing gear, hinge brackets from the rudder pedals, a damaged section of the ammunition feed tray, lengths of control cable wire, broken metal plates from the nose assembly. None of these were designed to be part of a firearm, but they could be shaped or aligned to provide stability for the barrel. He also scavenged pliers from the pilot's tool pouch, wire cutters, a screwdriver, several bolts and clamps loosened by the crash. One item was particularly useful, a curved steel bracket that once held part of the cannon feed system. This piece, despite being bent, was tough and could potentially anchor the barrel in place. Mercer set the parts aside in a dry patch of ground and organized them by size and function. He worked methodically, slow, deliberate, and always alert. Every few minutes, he paused to listen for footsteps, voices, or animal movement that might signal danger. He knew exactly why the Japanese would come. Crash sites offered metal, parts, and supplies they desperately needed. If any nearby unit saw the smoke, they would investigate. He didn't have much time. Before starting any attempt at construction, he inspected the pilot again. Inside a pocket, he found a small notepad with weather observations and a few notes likely written before takeoff. Nothing useful for his situation, but it gave the crash a human dimension. The pilot had been doing a simple reconnaissance flight. The smoke trail from his engine must have started miles earlier. Mercer gently closed the pilot's eyes and covered him with part of a torn parachute. There was nothing else he could do. Then he returned to the scattered metal pieces. He tested the barrel again. Still solid. He tested the spring. Still responsive. He looked at the ammunition box. Enough rounds for a brief fight. The idea forming in his mind was not normal. It was not encouraged by training. It was not something any manual would suggest. But he had the skills, the materials, and the need. He checked the surrounding jungle one last time. No voices. No movement. Just the distant hum of insects and the faint hiss of steam rising from the wreck. He sat down beside the broken Aerocabra, placed the barrel assembly across his knees, and began planning the construction of a weapon that should not exist. What he built next would determine whether he lived or died. Mercer did not begin building immediately. Before using tools or making noise, he needed to choose a location where he could work without being seen from a distance. The hillside around the crash was too exposed. Smoke still rose intermittently from the engine compartment, and any Japanese patrol could approach from above. He moved his collected parts, barrel assembly, springs, control rods, brackets, and a small tool kit, 20 meters downslope into a cluster of fallen logs partially hidden by vines. The ground here was dry and firm, and a thick vegetation provided concealment from three sides. He arranged leaves behind him to mask any silhouette. Once secure, he began examining each component individually, assessing what was usable and what would require modification. Understanding the weapon parts. The .30 caliber and /M2 aircraft machine gun was designed to fire from an open bolt and relied on the aircraft's rigid mounting for stability. Its rate of fire was several times faster than an infantry weapon. The receiver, the heart of the system, was destroyed, which meant Mercer could not build a functional automatic weapon. What he needed instead was a manually operated, single-shot firearm, something that could at least allow him to defend himself if discovered. He studied the barrel assembly first. The barrel was straight, intact, and threaded at the rear. The chamber was undamaged. The spring set was functional. The firing pin was bent at the tip, but only slightly. If reshaped, it could strike a primer with enough force to ignite a round. He tested the firing pin alignment by holding it against the barrel's rear opening, rotating it, and checking for binding. It moved smoothly enough to operate. Constructing a receiver. Mercer laid out several pieces of aluminum from the aircraft nose section. They were lightweight but rigid, which was ideal for forming a makeshift receiver housing. Using pliers and the flat screwdriver, he began bending two sheets into parallel plates, spacing them with small bolts and washers from the tool pouch. He installed two hinge brackets to serve as stabilization points. Each bracket wrapped around part of the barrel and prevented unwanted movement. The fit was crude but stable when tightened. He checked alignment constantly. If the barrel shifted during firing, even slightly, the recoil could tear the assembly apart or injure him. Building a trigger mechanism. Without a proper receiver group, he needed a way to deliver force to the firing pin manually. He examined several control rods from the cockpit. These rods once connected pedal movements to various control surfaces. One had a pivoting end that still rotated freely. This was useful. He cut a length of electrical cable, stripped the insulation, and used the bare wire to lash the control rod to the firing pin assembly. When pulled backward, the rod could draw the pin into a cock position. When released, the spring would push it forward with enough force to fire a round. He tested this motion several times. Pull, click. Release, snap. The sound was loud enough that he froze, listening for any reaction from the jungle. None came, creating a grip and support. A weapon needed something stable to hold on to. Mercer removed the broken wooden handle from his entrenching tool. It was shorter than a rifle stock, but long enough to serve as a grip or partial butt. He shaved one end using the knife until it fit between the receiver plates. Then he tightened it in place using two bolts and wire wraps for reinforcement. He lifted the assembly carefully. It resembled no recognizable firearm. It was roughly half the length of an M1 Garand, slightly heavier than expected and awkwardly balanced. But for a single-shot improvised gun, it was workable. Preparing ammunition. From the crushed ammunition box, Mercer selected the cleanest rounds, those not dented or corroded. He checked each cartridge individually by rolling it between his fingers. He placed the reliable ones in a small cloth pouch for quick access. He knew the /M2 fired the same .30 caliber cartridges used in many American ground weapons. As long as the firing pin struck cleanly and the chamber sealed well enough, the round should fire. Safety considerations. Mercer understood this improvised weapon could injure him if misaligned. He spent over an hour testing the fit between the barrel and the aircraft bracket that held it. He added additional wire reinforcement to prevent rotation. He pressed the firing pin into the primer of a spent casing to test depth and pressure. Satisfied that it would ignite a live round, he reassembled the weapon. The sun dropped behind the canopy while he worked. He noticed the light fading and lowered his profile in case any Japanese patrol moved in the evening. There was no sign of movement yet, but he stayed cautious. First dry tests. As darkness settled over the hillside, Mercer crouched behind a fallen log for protection. He held the weapon firmly, planted it against the ground, and performed several dry actions. Cocking the firing pin with the rod, aligning the barrel, simulating recoil bracing. Everything held together. He could feel the imperfections, loose play in some parts, uneven balance. But overall, the weapon functioned in the most basic mechanical sense. He picked up a single live round, held it between his fingers for a moment, and slid it into the rear of the barrel assembly. It seated easily. He did not fire it. Not yet. The noise would carry. Instead, he removed it and stored it again. Final preparations. By now, the jungle had grown dark. Insects filled the air with a constant background hum. Mercer wiped sweat and mud from his hands and checked the weapon one last time. It was finished. Not polished. Not perfect, but ready. He placed the improvised firearm beside him, covered the work area with foliage, and settled in for the night. He ate a small portion of rations, drank sparingly, and kept the weapon within arm's reach. He had no idea when the Japanese would come, but he knew they would. He lay awake listening to the crash site cooling, metal creaking across the slope. He mentally rehearsed loading, aiming, and firing until he drifted into an uneasy sleep. By morning, the weapon would be tested for real, and whether he survived depended on whether it actually worked. Mercer woke before sunrise, not because he was rested, but because the jungle became noticeably quieter, the kind of silence that meant something was moving nearby. He remained still for several seconds, listening. There were no voices, no metal clinking, no boots on soil. But he sensed movement in the undergrowth. He checked his improvised weapon. It had remained intact overnight. Moisture had gathered on the barrel, so he wiped it dry using a piece of cloth. He inspected the firing pin again. The spring still had tension. The wooden grip he had fitted felt solid. He loaded a single round. The cartridge slid in cleanly. That was a good sign. The light was just beginning to rise, filtering through the canopy in pale patches. Mercer remained hidden behind the logs he had used as cover. From his position, he could see about 10 meters downhill toward the crash area. Then he heard it, faint rustling, followed by short, quiet bursts of whispering in Japanese. A patrol, a small one, probably scouts sent to investigate the crash. Mercer knew that if they left and reported his presence, a larger force would appear within hours. He could not let them leave, but he also knew he had to let them come close. His improvised weapon was not accurate at long distances. He watched as 3 Japanese soldiers emerged through the dense vegetation. They moved slowly, rifles ready, advancing toward the wreck. Their uniforms were soaked from humidity. Their helmets were wrapped in netting. One carried a field bag. Another held a Type 99 Arisaka rifle with bayonet fixed. Scouts like these were trained to approach quietly and observe. If they found footprints, shell casings, or signs of American activity, they would signal for reinforcements. Mercer controlled his breathing and waited. The lead scout stepped over a pile of leaves, looked up the slope, and paused. He scanned the hillside. Mercer lowered himself slightly, keeping his profile below the log. The patrol leader gestured with 2 fingers, directing the others to spread out. They were getting close, too close. Mercer raised the improvised weapon, bracing the barrel between the V-shaped support of the fallen log. He positioned his thumb on the wire-wrapped trigger rod. His hands were steady despite the situation. Several years of mechanical work had taught him to stay calm when handling unpredictable equipment. He aimed at the chest of the lead scout. At this distance, barely 12 meters, he could not afford a miss. The moment the scout began lifting his rifle, Mercer fired. The recoil was sharp, heavier than he expected. The weapon bucked into his shoulder, but the shot fired cleanly. The lead scout fell backward, his rifle dropping from his hands. The remaining 2 soldiers reacted instantly. One shouted an alert and dove behind a cluster of roots. The other fired a quick shot in Mercer's direction. The round hit the log, sending wood fragments into Mercer's face. He ducked, ripped open the improvised chamber, and shook the spent casing out. His hands moved quickly. He loaded a second round, cocked the firing pin with the rod, and raised the weapon again. The second scout was moving to flank him. Mercer fired. The shot struck the man's upper torso. He collapsed forward and rolled down the slope. The third scout hesitated. He was young, maybe 18 or 19. His eyes shifted between Mercer's position and the thick brush behind him. His breathing was rapid. He was deciding whether to fight or run. He chose to run. He scrambled into the vegetation and disappeared almost immediately. Mercer fired once more, but the shot missed. It hit a tree trunk 2 meters to the scout's right. The sound echoed through the ravine. Mercer exhaled hard. His arms felt heavy from the tension. The improvised weapon had worked twice, but it had also revealed his position. He knew exactly what would happen next. The surviving scout would notify his unit. The Japanese would not send 3 men again. They would come with a full search team, 20, maybe more. It was only a matter of time. Mercer checked the weapon. The wooden hand grip had loosened slightly from the recoil, so he tightened the wire that held it in place. The firing pin tip had worn a little, but it still appeared functional. He cleaned the barrel with a piece of cloth to remove soot buildup. He gathered the remaining rounds, 36 usable cartridges, and placed them in rows beside him for quick access. He examined the terrain around him. The slope offered decent visibility but limited escape routes. He needed a more defensible position. He moved 20 meters uphill to an area where 2 large boulders formed a natural choke point. Vines and thick ferns provided partial cover. He positioned himself behind the largest rock, creating a narrow firing lane. His plan was simple. Let the Japanese come through the choke point in small numbers and engage them one at a time. He ate a small portion of the pilot's emergency rations. His stomach was tight from stress, but he forced himself to eat. He drank a small amount of water. Hydration would matter if the fight lasted longer than he expected. Mercer then settled into position, weapon in hand, eyes fixed on the narrow corridor below. He could hear distant movement, branches snapping, boots stepping on wet soil, faint murmur of voices. The search team was organizing. He knew they would come soon. And when they did, his improvised weapon would no longer be an experiment. It would be the only thing keeping him alive. The Japanese search team arrived faster than Mercer anticipated. Less than an hour after the surviving scout fled, the background noise of the jungle changed. Birds stopped calling. Insects quieted. The vegetation in the ravine began to shake in controlled, measured intervals, indicating multiple men moving in formation. Mercer tightened his grip on the improvised weapon and checked the ammunition laid out on the rock beside him. He had 35 functional rounds remaining. Each would have to count. His position was as good as he could make it. 2 boulders created a natural corridor that forced any approaching force to move single file or in a narrow group. Thick ferns covered his outline from the sides. The slope behind him provided an escape path if he needed to relocate. He slowed his breathing and watched the entrance to the choke point. The first Japanese soldier stepped into view. He was part of an infantry squad from the 6th Japanese Infantry Regiment, wearing a standard-issue Type 98 uniform and carrying a Type 99 rifle. His posture was cautious, and he scanned the hillside with discipline. Behind him came more soldiers, at least 15 visible at first glance, possibly more concealed by the foliage. Mercer waited until the lead man moved fully into the narrow corridor. Then he raised the weapon, braced it against the boulder, and fired. The shot echoed sharply. The recoil drove backward into his shoulder. The lead soldier collapsed instantly. Shouts erupted behind the fallen body. The Japanese reacted according to their doctrine, immediate suppression fire. Several soldiers dropped to one knee, firing upward into the vegetation where they believed the shot came from. Their rifle rounds struck branches, rocks, and tree trunks around Mercer's position. Splinters flew past his face. He ducked, ejected the spent casing, and loaded a second round. His movements were efficient but tense. He cocked the firing pin and leaned out just far enough to aim again. Another soldier advanced at a low crouch, firing in 3-round bursts. Mercer fired back. The shot struck the man in the abdomen. The soldier fell backward, dropping his rifle. More shouting. A whistle blast. The Japanese officer was giving instructions. Mercer didn't need to understand the language to know what came next. a flanking maneuver. Two soldiers broke off from the main formation, moving left to try to circle around the rocks. Mercer shifted position slightly to keep the choke point in view while monitoring his left flank. He saw movement, legs passing behind a cluster of ferns, and fired. The shot hit one soldier in the upper thigh, knocking him down. The second soldier tried to pull him to cover, but exposed his torso. Mercer loaded quickly and fired again. The second man dropped beside his comrade. The main body of Japanese troops pressed forward. Grenades rolled into the corridor, exploding against the boulders and sending soil and debris into the air. The blast shook Mercer's position. He covered his head briefly to avoid fragments. When he looked up, 3 soldiers were advancing rapidly through the dust of the explosions. Their rifles were raised, and they were shouting to each other as they moved. Mercer fired once. The first soldier fell. He reloaded immediately. Fired again. The second soldier stumbled. He reloaded a third time. Hands moving faster now, but still under control. Fired. The third soldier dropped to his knees and fell sideways. The Japanese officer blew the whistle again, this time signaling a coordinated rush. Mercer could hear men repositioning, branches breaking as they formed up for a charge. He leaned behind the rock, breathing hard. His shoulder ached from repeated recoil, and the improvised weapon's metal edges were starting to press painfully into his palm. But it still functioned. Every shot so far had fired without misfire or malfunction. He checked his ammunition, 26 rounds left. Movement erupted below him. 5 soldiers charged at once, using speed and aggression to overwhelm his position. Mercer fired into the center of the group. One man fell immediately. Another tripped over his body. The remaining 3 continued forward. Mercer loaded again, barely keeping pace. He fired a second shot. Another soldier dropped. He loaded and fired a third time, hitting a soldier who had nearly reached the base of the rocks. The fourth soldier raised his rifle and fired up the slope. The shot passed close enough that Mercer felt the bullet's shockwave. He ducked and reloaded again. The fifth soldier reached the lower boulder and began climbing. Mercer rose, aimed downward, and fired at close distance. The soldier fell backward into the brush. The charge collapsed. The Japanese regrouped several meters downhill. Mercer could hear the officer shouting new orders. The surviving scout, the young soldier who escaped earlier, was among them, pointing toward Mercer's position. He was visibly agitated, speaking quickly. Mercer wiped sweat from his forehead, rechecked his firing pin, and tightened a loose wire on the weapon. They were not done yet. The Japanese were formed into 2 groups, one suppressing his position with steady rifle fire, the other preparing another push. Their officer moved along the formation, directing fire with hand signals. He stepped into view briefly, sword at his side, studying the terrain. Mercer saw him clearly and took the shot. The recoil struck hard, but the round hit the officer in the upper chest. The man fell backward instantly. The unit's coordination faltered. Several soldiers hesitated. Some moved to help the officer. Others tried to take cover behind logs and rocks. Mercer used that hesitation. He fired again. One soldier down. Reload. Fire. Another down. Reload. Fire. Another rifleman collapsed behind a tree root. By now, Mercer's shoulder throbbed with each shot. His reloads were slower, and his breathing was sharper. But the Japanese force, reduced, disorganized, and missing its leader, began to pull back. Some soldiers helped carry their wounded. Others covered the retreat with short, precise bursts. They withdrew in clusters, slipping back through the same route they entered. After several minutes, the jungle fell still. The only sounds were insects returning to their normal rhythm and the distant rustle of departing soldiers. Mercer exhaled slowly. His hands were shaking, and his entire right arm felt numb from absorbing the recoil. He checked the weapon. The barrel was hot. The firing pin was slightly more worn, but still serviceable. The wooden grip was cracked but intact. He counted the fallen soldiers in sight. Several more lay beyond view in the brush. He had stopped a 20-man Japanese search team with a weapon built from aircraft scrap. He lowered the improvised gun, sat against the boulder, and let the tension release from his body. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and outnumbered but alive. For now, the storm had passed, but he knew it wouldn't be the last challenge he faced. He still had to survive the jungle and find his way back to American lines. The fight left Mercer physically drained. After the Japanese withdrew, he stayed behind the boulder for several minutes without moving. His hands were trembling. His shoulder felt bruised deep into the muscle. His throat was dry, and every breath carried a raw burn from the stress of firing and reloading so rapidly. He forced himself to stand and check the area. The bodies visible near the choke point confirmed what he already knew. The Japanese search team had taken heavy losses. The rest would regroup and report to their company. They would not launch another immediate attack without reinforcements. This meant two things. He had a short window of time before a larger force searched the area, and staying in the same position would guarantee being found. Mercer gathered his remaining ammunition, only 12 cartridges left now, and checked the improvised weapon again. The wooden handle was cracked in two places, but still functional. The firing pin spring felt weaker. He tightened the wiring and reinforced the cracks with strips torn from the parachute fabric he had taken earlier. He knew the weapon was nearing the end of its functional life, but might still fire a few more times if necessary. He moved uphill, staying close to dense vegetation to conceal his silhouette. His legs felt unsteady from fatigue and dehydration. The gash on his arm had reopened slightly during the fight and now bled through the cloth dressing. He tied a tighter bandage using part of the pilot's emergency kit. The jungle was thick, but the terrain gradually rose. He aimed to put distance between himself and the crash site, at least a few hundred meters. Any Japanese response force would head directly to the crash and then follow the trail left by the fallen soldiers. By moving perpendicular to his original route, he increased his chances of evading discovery. After nearly an hour of slow movement, he found a small depression between several tree roots, shielded by ferns. It wasn't a proper shelter, but it concealed him well enough. His strength was nearly gone, so he sat with his back against a tree and drank the last half of his water packet. It wasn't enough, but it kept him conscious. He did not sleep immediately. The sounds of the jungle carried differently now. He heard distant voices, shouting, commands, equipment clattering. The Japanese were searching. He forced himself to stay awake as the sounds came closer, then faded again, moving along a different ridge. Only after the voices grew distant did he allow himself to rest, though it was a shallow, uneasy sleep. He woke sometime in the late afternoon. His mouth was dry. His limbs were stiff. He had no sense of time beyond the light filtering through the canopy. He knew he needed to move again, deeper inland or toward the American perimeter, but he wasn't sure which direction was safer. Then he heard something unusual. Footsteps. Not soft, careful steps like the Japanese scouts used. These were heavier, more deliberate, and there were several of them. He tensed immediately, gripping the improvised weapon. But then he heard something that froze him. English voices. Hold up. Something's off here. Tracks looks like a firefight. Mercer crawled forward slightly, fighting dizziness, until he saw movement through the ferns. A four-man Marine patrol moved cautiously along the ridge, weapons ready. Their uniforms were different from the Army's, darker, with distinct camouflage patterns. They wore leggings and carried M1 carbines. One Marine spotted movement in the brush and raised his rifle. Contact. Mercer raised a hand weakly. Don't shoot. American. The Marines paused. One motioned for the others to hold. They advanced slowly, rifles aimed until they were sure. The first Marine knelt beside him. Jesus, your Army. What happened to you? Mercer's voice was barely above a whisper. Patrol ambushed behind their lines, crash site. Had to improvise. The Marine noticed the weapon across Mercer's lap. He frowned, leaned closer, and stared for several seconds. What is that thing? Mercer glanced at it. Only thing I had. The Marine gently took it, turning it in his hands. You built this. Mercer nodded. The Marines exchanged looks, part disbelief, part respect, part confusion. The corporal in charge finally spoke. All right, we're getting you out of here. Can you walk? Mercer tried to stand, but his legs buckled. Two Marines moved quickly, each taking an arm. They began the slow journey back toward American lines. Along the route, Mercer told them only basic details. He didn't have the strength for more. The Marines examined the terrain as they walked, bodies in the choke point, discarded Japanese gear, blood trails. One Marine whistled quietly. "How many did you fight off?" Mercer replied simply, "Enough." When they reached the perimeter, a medic took him immediately. His dehydration was severe, and his arm wound needed cleaning. His shoulder was bruised from repeated recoil. He was given water and four in a blanket. Later that evening, an ordnance officer arrived to examine the improvised weapon. He placed it on a table, looked it over slowly, and shook his head. "How did this even fire?" Mercer answered honestly, "I tested alignment. The rest was luck." The officer examined the firing pin and the makeshift receiver. "This is functional. Dangerous, but functional. If someone handed this to me, I'd call them insane. But you got to work." He ordered photographs taken for documentation. The weapon was tagged and placed in a crate for transport. Mercer was moved to a medical tent for the night. He lay on a cot, finally safe, listening to the faint, distant sounds of gunfire from other parts of the island. For the first time since the ambush, he slept without fear of footsteps approaching in the dark. The next morning, a Marine lieutenant briefed him on Japanese activity. They had recovered their dead and withdrawn. No search teams had gotten close to the perimeter. Mercer realized then that the improvised weapon had saved his life long enough for rescue to reach him. His ordeal was effectively over. But the story of what he had built and what he had done with it was only beginning to spread. Corporal Daniel Mercer spent the next 2 days in a field medical station near Cape Torquena. His condition was stable, but showed the strain of everything he had endured. Dehydration, minor shrapnel wounds, a deep shoulder bruise from repeated firing of the improvised weapon. His arm wound was cleaned and stitched. He slept for long stretches, waking periodically as medics checked his vitals. Word of his experience traveled quickly through the small camp. Not as a heroic tale. Most soldiers were too exhausted for that. But as a matter-of-fact report of a soldier who had survived against odds that usually left no survivors. Marines and Army infantrymen who heard fragments of the story were more curious than anything else. How'd he make a gun out of plane? Is that even possible? They say he held off 20 of them. Hell of a thing, if true. The interest was practical rather than sensational. In jungle warfare, improvisation could mean the difference between life and death. On the third day, Mercer spoke with an intelligence officer conducting routine debriefings for anyone recovered from behind Japanese lines. The interview took place under a canvas tent with a map table between them. Mercer sat stiffly, still sore from the ordeal. The officer began formally, documenting the ambush, the patrol's initial objective, and the events that followed. Mercer described the terrain, the enemy's ambush positions, and the direction the Japanese search teams had moved afterward. Everything he said was recorded, useful information for future patrols. When the officer reached the part about the improvised weapon, he paused. "We've seen photographs. It's unusual. How did you decide to make it?" Mercer answered plainly, "I couldn't move far without water. I didn't have a rifle. The barrel assembly from the crash was intact, so I tried to make something that could fire at least one round." The officer leaned back in his chair. "You understand that what you did isn't standard procedure." Mercer nodded. "I didn't have any standard options left." The officer didn't argue. He simply wrote the response and turned the page. Later that afternoon, the ordnance specialist returned to speak with Mercer. He carried a clipboard with close-up photographs of the improvised weapon. "We documented everything," he said. "It'll be used in a report on field improvisations. May even make it back to the States for evaluation. I can tell you this. What you built shouldn't have worked. Too much stress on the barrel mount. Too much risk of misalignment. Yet you kept it firing." Mercer didn't respond. He was staring at one of the photos. The weapon looked even stranger on paper than it had in his hands. Crude, uneven, made from parts that had never been meant to interact. The ordnance officer continued. "You're lucky, Corporal, but you were also careful. Most soldiers would have fired that thing once and blown their fingers off. Mercer set the photo down. "I did what I had to." The officer nodded. That's usually how these stories go. 2 days later, Mercer was cleared for limited duty. He was not sent back into the jungle. Instead, he was reassigned temporarily to logistical support until the division's next rest rotation. No official commendation was issued. There wasn't a specific regulation for something like this, and Mercer never asked for one. For the men around him, the story faded into the background noise of war. Bougainville continued to demand attention. New patrols, new engagements, new casualties. Eventually, Mercer returned to full duty. He completed the Bougainville campaign and later served in Luzon. Nothing in those operations resembled the desperate situation he had faced on that hillside. After the war ended in 1945, Mercer returned to Oregon. He worked in machine repair shops, married, and built a quiet life. He rarely talked about the jungle, the ambush, or the improvised weapon. When asked about the war, he mentioned the long marches, the heat, and the friends he lost. The rest stayed with him. The improvised firearm itself disappeared into the military supply system. The crate containing it was moved from Bougainville to a rear depot, then to another storage facility. Records show it was logged in a field report but not kept as a permanent exhibit. Like many battlefield curiosities, it was eventually discarded or absorbed into scrap reclamation. Its existence lived on only in the written documentation and a handful of photographs. In time, even those were forgotten. But the truth of what happened remained unchanged. A single soldier, trapped behind enemy lines, used his mechanical knowledge to create a working firearm from the wreckage of a downed aircraft. He used that improvised weapon to repel a force that should have overwhelmed him. He survived long enough to be rescued, not because of luck alone, but because he refused to stop thinking, refused to stop working, and refused to give up control of his own fate. His story was not about heroism, and it never became one. It was simply an example of what survival demanded during the Pacific War: ingenuity, discipline, and a determination that went beyond fear. And for one soldier on Bougainville, those qualities were enough.